He was just a single father, running out of chances, hoping for one last shot at a steady job. But on his way to an interview, fate struck, a car crash, flames, and a split-second choice that changed everything. He saved a stranger's life, but what he didn't know was that this woman would soon stand in front of him, holding the power to decide his future. From that moment, his world of struggle and her world of power collided, and nothing would ever be simple again. Whispers spread, hearts clashed, and choices had to be made. Was it destiny? Or a dangerous mistake? Sometimes the most ordinary man carries an extraordinary story, and this one begins not with gratitude, but with fire. Now let's dive in. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Derek Miller's small apartment, drawing pale streaks across the faded carpet. He crouched low in front of his daughter, Chloe, carefully looping the frayed shoelaces of her pink sneakers into a neat bow. His fingers trembled slightly, not from lack of practice, but from the heavy weight of the day ahead. Chloe, only 4 years old, sat perched on the edge of a worn chair, swinging her little legs, watching her father with wide-eyed trust. When he gave the bow a final tug, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, giggling softly. Her embrace, so small and innocent, pressed directly against the storm in his chest. Derek kissed her forehead and whispered, "Daddy's got this," though the words were more for himself than for her. Carrying her down the creaking stairs of their aging building, Derek felt the old boards groan beneath his boots. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled coffee and dust, familiar scents that clung to their modest life. Outside, Mrs. Turner, their kind neighbor, was already waiting by her doorway. The older woman smiled warmly as Chloe bounded toward her with crayons clutch, it in her tiny hand. Derek bent to kiss his daughter's cheek again, his heart twisting at the way she clung to him, reluctant to let go. "I'll be back soon, Pumpkin," he promised. She gave a little nod, brave but hesitant, and he forced himself to turn away. Every step toward the street was heavy, knowing that today might shape the rest of their lives. The city streets buzzed with the early morning rhythm, buses hissing at curbs, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of traffic. Derek's heart pounded louder than the noise around him. He clutched the folder with his resume against his chest, rehearsing silent answers to questions he hoped the interviewers would ask. His reflection in a passing window caught his eye. Wrinkled shirt, scuffed shoes, a face lined by exhaustion but lifted by determination. For Chloe, he reminded himself, tightening his stride. For Chloe, he would endure anything. But the world had other plans for his morning. A sharp screech of tires shattered the normalcy, ripping through the air like a scream. Derek's head whipped toward the sound, just in time to see a sleek black luxury car spin out of control. Metal crunched against a streetlight pole with bone-jarring violence, the impact sending sparks dancing across the pavement. A second later, flames licked hungrily from beneath the hood, curling upward into a blaze. Gasoline spilled and hissed, feeding the fire, painting the air with the acrid stench of burning fuel. Without thinking, Derek dropped his folder and sprinted toward the wreckage. His body moved on instinct, heart hammering, lungs seizing against the smoke that already began to cloud the street. Heat pressed against his skin as he reached the driver's side, tugging at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The fire crackled, growing louder, more vicious, threatening to consume everything in seconds. Through the shattered glass, he caught sight of a woman trapped inside, her hands slamming weakly against the steering wheel, panic etched into her face. "Hold on!" Derek shouted, though his voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of the flames. He yanked harder, muscles straining, sweat mixing with soot that clung to his skin. The door groaned but stayed shut, locked in place by the twisted frame. Smoke billowed into his eyes, burning, but he refused to turn away. He grabbed a nearby chunk of metal debris and smashed it against the window until it cracked, then reached in to unlock the handle. Heat singed his arm as he shoved his shoulder against the warped door, finally wrenching it open. The woman inside gasped for air, coughing violently as flames clawed closer. Derek reached for her, his hands wrapping around her arms as he pulled with every ounce of strength. She stumbled free, her elegant dress torn and scorched, heels snapping against the asphalt as they tumbled together to the ground. Behind them, the car gave a deafening pop, then erupted into a fireball that lit up the morning like a second sun. Derek shielded her with his body as the shockwave rattled the street. For a moment, silence fell. Only the crackling of flames filled the air. The woman trembled, clutching her chest, her flawless appearance marred by soot and ash. Her eyes locked on Derek, and he expected gratitude, relief, or even disbelief. Instead, her lips parted, and her voice, sharp yet quivering, cut into him. Do you have any idea what could have happened to you? The words stunned him. After risking his life, after pulling her from death's grasp, she didn't thank him. She scolded him. Derek blinked, his breath still ragged, unsure if he'd heard right. Her tone was not cruel, but it carried something else. Fear, anger, perhaps a mix of both, that confused him more than the fire ever could. Before he could ask who she was or why she spoke that way, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, weaving through the city streets. Red and blue lights flickered closer, reflecting against the smoke that still hung, heavy in the air. Paramedics and firefighters rushed forward, shouting commands, pulling Derek and the woman apart to check them for injuries. As Derek sat back on the curb, chest heaving, he turned his eyes toward her once more. The woman's features were hidden behind the flurry of medics, but he caught her gaze. Intense, unreadable, as if she were more concerned with what she had seen in him than the fire she had just escaped. And in that moment, Derek realized something unsettling. Whoever this woman was, this encounter wasn't finished. The flames were out, but something else had been ignited. Something that left him with a question burning hotter than the fire itself. Who was she, really? And why did fate place her in his path today? Hours later, the smoke and chaos of the morning still clung to Derek's clothes, lingering like a shadow he couldn't shake. His shirt smelled faintly of ash, his palms still bore faint scrapes from wrenching open that mangled car door, and yet here he was, sitting on a leather chair outside the pristine interview room of Harrington Enterprises. His knee bounced restlessly as he gripped the folder on his lap, its corners bent from his frantic sprint earlier. This building, with its glass walls and marble floors, felt like another world entirely. Clean, polished, untouchable. Derek shifted uncomfortably, wondering if the receptionist at the desk could smell the smoke on him, if the board inside would take one look at him and dismiss him as a man who didn't belong. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. Chloe's face appeared in his thoughts, her small hands waving as he left her with Mrs. Turner, her trusting eyes asking him without words to come back with good news. That image gave him enough strength to stay seated, to force himself not to walk out before his name was even called. He needed this chance, no matter how unprepared or out of place he felt. "Mr. Derek Miller?" a voice finally called from the doorway. Derek rose to his feet, his legs stiff, his pulse pounding in his ears. He smoothed his shirt quickly, though the wrinkles refused to flatten, and stepped into the room. The air inside was cooler, heavier, filled with the quiet authority of power. Around the long mahogany table sat a group of sharply dressed board members, their gazes sharp, their pens poised above notepads. And then his heart stopped. At the head of the table, framed by the towering windows that overlooked the city, sat her, Madison Harrington, the very woman he had dragged from the burning car that morning. Her tailored suit was immaculate, her hair neatly pinned, her expression composed into the perfect mask of a corporate titan. But as her eyes lifted and met his, the mask cracked. For a fleeting heartbeat, her composure slipped. Her hand froze mid-turn of a page. Her lips parted ever so slightly, and her eyes widened. Not in the cold recognition of a CEO reviewing a stranger's resume, but in shock. The room seemed to still around them, as though every whisper of air had been sucked away. Madison pushed back her chair and stood, the scrape of its legs echoing sharply against the polished floor. A murmur rippled among the board members, brows furrowing, whispers exchanged. Her heels struck the ground with steady, deliberate beats as she walked around the table, each step echoing like a drum in Derek's chest. He wanted to move, to breathe, but his body locked in place as she drew closer, her gaze fixed entirely on him. Derek braced himself for humiliation. He could already imagine her words, a dismissal, a cold reminder that janitorial jobs had plenty of applicants, that a man like him didn't belong in these halls. He thought of Chloe again, and his throat tightened with dread at the thought of returning home empty-handed. But when Madison stopped just inches away, everything shifted. Her eyes, a piercing shade of grey that seemed to hold storms within them, fixed on his. She leaned in slightly, her voice low, a whisper meant for his ears alone. "It's you." The words weren't sharp. They weren't dismissive. They were something else, an echo of recognition, disbelief, perhaps even gratitude buried beneath layers of control. Derek's chest tightened, his thoughts scrambling for meaning. Did she recognize him as her rescuer? Was this acknowledgement going to help him, or would it expose him to consequences he couldn't foresee? The boardroom was silent now. The whispers had died. Every pair of eyes pinned on the two figures standing so close in the center of the room. Derek could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity thick enough to choke on. He shifted uneasily, wishing he understood the rules of this new battlefield he had stumbled into. Madison's gaze didn't waver. Her lips pressed together for a brief moment, as if she were fighting the urge to say more, to break the polished facade she carried in front of her board. Then, with a quiet inhale, she straightened her shoulders and turned slightly, signaling to the others with nothing more than a look that demanded silence. The power she held over them was undeniable. Not one dared to interrupt. Derek stood frozen, his mind a storm. His pulse thudded in his ears as he tried to piece together what was happening. Why hadn't she exposed him or dismissed him? Why did her voice carry a weight that felt more personal than professional? "Mr. Miller," one of the board members finally said, clearing his throat, as if attempting to bring the room back into order. But the words barely registered. Derek's focus remained on Madison, who had taken a slow step back, but kept her eyes locked on his, as though testing him, as though silently asking a question he couldn't yet decipher. His hands tightened around the folder he carried. Every second in that room stretched like an eternity. The job he had come to interview for suddenly felt tangled in something far larger, something far more dangerous than just employment. And as Madison finally moved back toward her chair, resuming her place at the head of the table with regal poise, Derek's chest tightened. He couldn't tell if what had just happened was the beginning of an opportunity or the opening of a trap. Derek never truly understood why he got the job. One moment he was standing frozen in that boardroom, the weight of Madison Harrington's eyes burning into him, and the next he was holding a letter of employment, his name typed neatly on paper that felt far too official for someone like him. Gratitude swelled inside him, but confusion lingered just as strong. Had she given him this position out of recognition for saving her life? Or had she seen something in him no one else ever had? He didn't ask, and she didn't say. Instead, he showed up each morning in the dark blue uniform they provided, broom in hand, mop bucket rolling beside him, determined to work as though every corner he scrubbed might secure Chloe's future. At first, Madison's presence in his daily routine seemed almost coincidental. A quick question about the air conditioning, a passing inquiry about a squeaky elevator door. Yet, as days turned into weeks, Derek began to notice a pattern. Her visits weren't fleeting. She lingered, her eyes watching him longer than necessary, her questions carrying undertones that had nothing to do with janitorial tasks. There were moments when the office corridor seemed too quiet, her footsteps echoing as she approached, her gaze holding something unspoken that unsettled and intrigued him all at once. He told himself not to think too much of it. She was a CEO, powerful, untouchable. He was a janitor, replaceable, invisible, but her presence kept tugging at the edges of his thoughts long after she walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the echo of her questions. Then came the Saturday. It was supposed to be a day off, a rare chance for Janitor Rick to breathe, to sit in his cramped apartment and draw silly pictures with Chloe, to cook something simple on the rusted stove. He wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not her. When the knock came at the door, Chloe scurried across the living room, crayons clutched in her small hands, her hair a little wild from play. She flung the door open before Derek could stop her, and there she was, Madison Harrington. Not in her immaculate suits, not with the cold authority of the boardroom wrapped around her shoulders, but in jeans and a simple blouse. For a second, Derek couldn't process it. The woman who commanded skyscrapers with a glance now stood awkwardly at the threshold of his peeling apartment door. Madison's gaze flickered past him into the dimly lit space where toys were scattered on the floor and the wallpaper curled at the corners. She hesitated, as though crossing into his world meant stepping through a barrier she'd never dared before. Chloe, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tilted her head and asked brightly, "Are you here to see Daddy?" Madison's lips curved into something that wasn't quite her usual practiced smile. It was softer, almost uncertain. "Yes," she answered, her voice gentle, as if she were afraid to shatter the fragile warmth floating in the air. Derek cleared his throat, still reeling. "Come in," he managed, stepping aside. She entered, and for the first time in years, Derek saw his home through someone else's eyes. The sagging couch patched with old fabric, the chipped coffee table, the faded drawings Chloe had taped proudly on the fridge. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And now, Madison Harrington was standing in the middle of it. Chloe darted back to the floor, resuming her coloring with fierce concentration, humming softly as she scribbled with broken crayons. Madison's eyes followed her for a long moment. The powerful CEO of Harrington Enterprises watching a 4-year-old draw crooked flowers on cheap paper. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor she always wore. "Would you like something to eat?" Derek asked, his voice cautious, uncertain how to host someone so out of place in his world. Without waiting for her answer, he moved into the kitchen. The smell of butter soon filled the air as he placed bread on a pan, sizzling softly, transforming into grilled cheese, Chloe's favorite, and one of the few meals he could make without burning. Madison leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed loosely, not in authority but in thought. She watched Derek move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, watched Chloe twirl barefoot across the worn linoleum floor, her laughter bright and unburdened. The scene was ordinary, humble, yet it pressed against Madison's chest in a way no board meeting ever had. She found herself smiling, not the polished, calculated smile for cameras, but a genuine one she hadn't felt in years. Chloe spun toward Madison, holding up her drawing with pride. "Do you like it?" she asked. Madison crouched down to the little girl's level, taking the paper carefully in her hands. The crayon lines were crooked, the colors spilling outside the borders, but something about the pure joy in Chloe's eyes made it feel like a masterpiece. "It's beautiful," Madison said softly, and Chloe beamed. Dinner was eaten in laughter, Chloe chattering about her imaginary adventures, Derek listening with patient smiles, and Madison simply sitting there, absorbing it all. Each sound, each smile, each imperfect detail wrapped around her like a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. But eventually, the evening drew to a close. Madison rose to leave, smoothing her blouse nervously, as if reluctant to step back into her world of glass towers and iron expectations. At the door, Chloe tugged at her sleeve, her little voice sweet and sincere. "Will you come back? Daddy smiles more when you're here." The words struck Madison like a lightning bolt. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, eyes glistening in the dim hallway light. She managed a small nod, but as she stepped outside, her hand lingered against the wall, trembling slightly. For a woman who negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, it was a strange, unsettling feeling. Walking down that hallway, Chloe's words echoed in her chest, each syllable sharper than any boardroom confrontation. "Daddy smiles more when you're here." Madison's pace slowed, her thoughts spiraling. Why had a child's voice pierced deeper than the endless praise of investors, the fear of rivals, the applause of success? Why did a cramped apartment with peeling paint feel more alive than her penthouse in the sky? And as she paused in the stairwell, her hand gripping the rail to steady herself, a realization flickered in her heart like a fragile flame. Something was happening inside her. Something she wasn't ready to name, but something she knew she could no longer ignore. Madison hadn't meant to return so soon after that first visit, but something drew her back again, and then again after that. What began as an occasional stop quickly grew into a rhythm neither of them admitted aloud. Saturdays bled into weeknights, evenings into dinners, until her presence became as natural in Derek's apartment as the soft hum of Chloe's laughter. She brought groceries when she came, fresh fruit, milk, bread, and though Derek insisted it wasn't necessary, she would set the bags on the counter with quiet finality. Toys appeared in corners, a dollhouse by the wall, picture books stacked neatly near Chloe's bed. Piece by piece, the life of a powerful CEO was blending into the life of a janitor and his daughter, reshaping the small apartment into something warmer, fuller. The conversation stretched long past the hours they should have ended. At first they were about work, little remarks about company meetings, about the building itself, about the fire they had both survived. But gradually, words dug deeper. Madison found herself speaking about things she had never confessed to anyone. Her loneliness in penthouses that overlooked the city, her father's shadow in the empire she ran, the suffocating pressure of power. Derek listened quietly, his rough hands folded in his lap, his eyes steady in a way that made her feel safe to unravel. And in return, he spoke about Chloe, about his struggles, about the nights he wondered if he was enough. But the world outside their fragile circle wasn't blind. Inside Harrington Enterprises, whispers began to grow. A CEO of Madison's stature did not spend time with janitors without notice. Board members exchanged skeptical glances, voices lowered, but words sharp. It's reckless. It's unprofessional. What could she possibly see in him? Employees gossiped in break rooms, weaving stories from fragments, their envy and disbelief fueling the fire. Derek heard some of it, bits and pieces that floated back to him like poisonous echoes. He pretended to ignore them, but the words gnawed at him in silence. The weight of it all seeped into Derek's heart, turning quiet moments with Madison into battles within himself. He noticed the groceries stacked in the fridge and wondered if he was failing as a father by letting someone else provide. He watched Chloe play with toys far nicer than anything he could afford and questioned if Madison's presence was a gift or a reminder of what he couldn't give. Every laugh they shared, every late-night conversation carried a shadow, the growing fear that this fragile bond was doomed to break under the pressure of two worlds colliding. One evening, the tension spilled into words. They were sitting in the living room, Chloe asleep in her small bed down the hall, the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. Madison had just set down 2 mugs of tea, her eyes tired yet soft as she watched Derek, but he couldn't meet her gaze. His hands twisted together, his jaw tight, the heaviness in so, his chest finally demanding release. "You don't need to do this," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than volume. The words hung in the air, heavy enough to still the room. Madison frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "Do what? All of this?" His hand gestured vaguely at the groceries, the toys, the warmth she carried into their lives. "You're a CEO. You don't need to spend your nights here, with me, with Chloe. I'm just me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he looked down, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. For a moment, silence pressed in. Madison's chest rose and fell, her lips parting, her eyes shimmering with something he couldn't name. She set her mug down slowly, as if steadying herself against words too sharp to carry. Then she stood, crossing the small room with deliberate steps. She stopped in front of him, her presence so close he could feel the warmth radiating off her. Her voice, when it came, trembled, not with weakness, but with emotion straining to be contained. "You're not just you, Derek." He looked up, startled, meeting eyes that held storms within them. "You're the man who risked his life for me," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "The man who makes Chloe laugh like the world is hers. The man who makes me—" She stopped abruptly, her throat tightening, the unspoken word choking her before it could escape. The room seemed to shrink around them, filled with everything unsaid. Her breath caught, his silence pressed heavy, and for one charged moment, neither moved. Pride held her back, fear held him back, and between them, something fragile teetered on the edge of breaking or becoming. And as the rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the glass, both of them stood in that suspended space, hearts colliding in silence, wondering what words would finally shatter the wall, or whether they'd let the moment slip into the dark, unspoken forever. The rain came hard that night, hammering against the thin glass of Derek's apartment windows, as if the world itself was urging an answer to the silence that had lingered between them. Inside, the air still held the echo of Madison's unfinished words, the ones that had caught in her throat, the ones that Derek hadn't dared to push her to finish. He sat on the couch long after she had left that evening, staring at the grooves in his calloused hands, feeling the weight of all that was unsaid pressing like a stone on his chest. Sleep never came easily. When it finally did, it was restless and shallow, filled with dreams of Chloe's laughter mixing with Madison's eyes, her voice breaking on the edge of confession. By morning, nothing had changed. By evening, the heaviness had only deepened. He went through the motions of his day, sweeping hallways, changing bulbs, fixing small things while his mind wrestled with the bigger one. Whether a man like him could ever belong in the world of a woman like her. But fate, relentless as ever, didn't wait for his answer. It came pounding at his door with the storm. When Derek opened it, the sight before him left him breathless. Madison stood there, rain dripping down her face, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her blouse clinging from the storm. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her eyes, fierce, unwavering, held the strength of someone who had made a decision she could no longer run from. She looked nothing like the untouchable CEO of Harrington Enterprises in that moment. She looked human. She looked vulnerable. She looked like someone who had fought herself and finally surrendered. "Madison," Derek breathed, stunned, his voice nearly lost to the thunder rolling above them. He half expected her to say nothing, to turn and leave. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice breaking through the storm, trembling, but certain. "Derek, let me be part of your life," she whispered, the words raw, stripped of the polish she always wore. "Not because you saved me that day, but because every day since, you've saved me in ways you'll never realize." For a moment he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his chest pounding as her words sank into him. He had told himself over and over that she didn't need to be here, that she didn't belong in this life of peeling paint and second-hand furniture. Yet here she was, standing in the storm, asking not for permission to step into his world, but for the chance to stay in it. Behind him, a small shuffle broke the silence. Chloe peeked around her father's leg, her sleepy eyes wide as they took in the sight of Madison dripping in the doorway. She blinked once, twice, then tilted her head, her innocent voice slicing through the moment with a purity that neither adult could have mustered. "Does that mean you'll stay forever?" The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful all at once. Madison's composure faltered. She knelt right there on the doormat, her knees soaking in the rainwater that had crept inside. Her hands reached out gently, brushing Chloe's hair back as tears mixed with raindrops on her cheeks. Her voice, soft but unshakable, answered the question that had silenced them both. "If your daddy lets me." Derek's breath caught. His heart thundered so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. He had lived years believing he was a man who had nothing, just a janitor fighting to hold his little girl's world together with scraps of hope. Yet here he stood, Chloe's innocent eyes pleading, Madison's trembling hand reaching, and suddenly everything he had ever thought he lacked was standing right in front of him, waiting. The storm outside raged, but in the doorway a quieter storm swirled, one of love, fear, and the courage to accept what was being offered. Derek's hand lifted slowly, almost afraid the moment would dissolve if he moved too quickly. But woo seat. Hen, his fingers finally closed around Madison's, the warmth of her grip cut through the cold, anchoring him in a way he had never felt before. Chloe squealed softly, wrapping her arms around them, both as though sealing the unspoken promise. Madison laughed through her tears, the sound fragile and new, as if it had been trapped for years and was finally free. Derek's eyes burned, but for the first time in a long while, they burned with something more than exhaustion. They burned with hope. He pulled Madison gently inside, away from the rain, into the imperfect little apartment that suddenly felt like the most important place in the world. She didn't look at the cracked walls or the worn furniture. She only looked at him, her gaze steady, as if to say she had chosen this life, chosen him, chosen them. Derek exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his voice low, filled with awe. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like, Madison, but if you're here, if you're really here." He paused, glancing down at Chloe's bright face, then back at Madison's tear-streaked one. "Then maybe forever doesn't seem so impossible." Her lips curved into a trembling smile as she leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. Outside, the rain began to soften, the storm easing into a steady rhythm, as though even the sky understood that something had shifted. In that doorway, where despair had once stood, where loneliness had often lingered, there was now laughter, warmth, and a promise that didn't need grand speeches to be real. Derek held Madison's hand tightly, Chloe nestled between them, and he realized with stunning clarity that his life had not been defined by what he lacked, but by what he had been given. And as the storm faded into the night, Derek understood that some stories don't begin with thank you. They begin with forever.